In the darkness of the night, when everything becomes blurry with the stillness and shadows, there lies a secret so hidden that most would never understand it. Miss Marple, with her trembling hands, had just uncovered an old tale, one filled not only with fear but with a truth so deeply buried that it was time to bring it to light. Are you ready? Just a few more steps, and the hidden truth will be within reach. But once you uncover it, how will you ever leave it behind? Will Miss Marple unravel the mystery? Or will something remain hidden forever? After months of recovering from a lingering illness that had drained not just her lungs but her spirit, Miss Eliza Merrow, an astute solitary woman with a taste for quiet observation and a lifelong distrust of coincidence, was gently urged by her doctor to seek the tonic of sea air. With her usual methodical calm, she packed her small, well-worn suitcase, 3 woolen cardigans, 2 thick skirts, a flask of strong tea leaves, her late sister's lavender-scented shawl, and her ever-faithful knitting bag. The coastal town of Windermere Bay was a place she remembered only faintly from childhood. Grey skies, gull cries, and the scent of salt clinging to stone, but it held just enough nostalgia to feel oddly appropriate. Her destination was the White Heron Inn, an aging Edwardian relic perched like a stubborn memory atop the wind-scoured cliffs. Once the pride of seaside luxury, it now served as a fading sanctuary for middle-class vacationers, the sort who believed in etiquette, travel clocks, and well-folded umbrellas. The inn had been suggested by an old acquaintance who'd taken to herbal remedies and seances of late, an eccentric woman with a fondness for forgotten places and their lingering silences. From the moment Miss Merrow stepped into the inn's reception hall, with its dusty crown molding and the persistent scent of lemon polish barely masking the mildew, something in her tightened, not in fear but in awareness. The brass fittings were tarnished, the floral wallpaper faded to the color of old bones, and a lone chandelier swung ever so slightly despite the still air. The young porter, lanky, distracted, and far too eager, nearly overturned her suitcase and muttered apologies while placing her hatbox the wrong way up. But it wasn't the clumsy service that caught her attention. It was the small cork notice board behind the front desk, where among outdated menus and faded seaside postcards, a single card had been pinned in haste. It read, simply, Room 17, closed until further notice. No explanation, no apology, just those words, hanging like a whispered warning. "Oh, how fortunate you are," chirped the receptionist with a smile that stretched too thin. "Someone cancelled just this morning, so I've placed you in room 16, right next door. You'll adore the sea view." Miss Merrow, never one to challenge politeness directly, simply nodded, though the room number nestled uneasily in her mind like a puzzle piece from the wrong box. Her new quarters were modest and frayed, worn rug, cracked mirror, the kind of wardrobe that might sigh at night when no one watched, but clean. The wallpaper depicted faded carnations dancing in pale pink, and the bedspread held the vague scent of lavender and age. Outside, the sea rolled under a steel-colored sky, waves slapping the rocks like soft accusations. As she unpacked, placing her knitting neatly beside the tea tray, she paused only once, when her hand brushed the thin wall that connected her room to room 17. Later, as she fastened her brooch with careful precision, she heard them, voices, hushed but urgent, leaking through the floorboards, or perhaps the ventilation grates. A young woman's voice, brittle with anxiety, hissed, "I told her not to place anyone there again, not after last time." Another voice, older, clipped and sharp as glass, answered in low rebuke, the words too muffled to make out, but the tone clear. "You know better than to speak of it." Miss Merrow didn't move. Years of listening to village whispers had taught her the weight of tone, the shape of unspoken truths. Hotel gossip was far more dangerous, because no one truly knew each other, and yet everyone wore masks. When the bellboy brought in her tea tray, his hands fidgeting, his eyes refusing to settle, she offered a gentle smile. "Tell me, dear," she said mildly, "does room 17 always remain closed?" He froze, then forced a laugh that cracked at the edges. "Just maintenance, miss. You know how old buildings are. Pipes, heating, that sort of thing. She thanked him, and as he turned, she saw the way his fingers trembled against the doorframe. Not fear of her, but fear of what might listen. Later still, while the sun began to sink and shadows elongated like stretching memories, the chambermaid arrived to freshen the towels. A pink-faced girl with too much nervous energy, and not enough guile. She tried to act casual, but failed under Miss Merrow's calm scrutiny. "That room's been strange for years," the girl whispered, glancing down the hall as if it might open its mouth and bite her. "Since before the war, really. Some say it's cursed. Guest went missing once, just vanished. Left behind his luggage, coat still on the hook. They searched the cliffs, the village. Nothing. Room was locked from the inside. We don't speak of it now." Before Miss Merrow could ask more, the receptionist reappeared, too suddenly, and laughed with that same hollow brightness. "Silly talk," she said. "These old places breed stories. Guests imagine things. Doors creak, lights flicker. It's all just bad wiring and long nights. Room 17 is perfectly ordinary." Miss Merrow met her eyes and smiled. "I quite agree," she replied. "Ordinary things are often the ones we ought to watch most closely." That night, as the inn settled into uneasy quiet, and the wind pressed against the glass like a beggar begging to be let in, Miss Merrow sat in her armchair, shawl draped over her shoulders, knitting idle in her lap. The wall between her and room 17 seemed thinner than before, almost pulsing. At precisely midnight, she heard it 3 knocks, faint but deliberate, not from her door, but from the other side of the wall. Then silence, then a whisper, so faint, it could have been breath. "I never left." Miss Merrow didn't scream. She simply rose, walked to the wall, and placed her hand upon it, fingers splayed. And though the wall should have been cold, it was warm, very warm, as if someone were standing on the other side, palm to palm with her, separated only by history, fear, and a locked door, ready for the next part when you are. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a bruised purple, the wind rose with sudden force, hissing through the narrow gaps in the old window panes of the cliffside inn, and carrying with it a whisper of brine and distant storms. Miss Aldora Wren, having folded away her evening shawl and finished her lavender tea, sat near the window with her knitting needles clinking in quiet rhythm. Her pale blue eyes fixed not on her scarf, but on the vague shimmer of light over the sea. Knitting always helped her think more clearly, and tonight something in the air felt oddly unsettled, as though the building itself were holding its breath. The corridor beyond her door was still, muffled in the expectant hush that follows dinner in such a genteel place. Only the faint rustle of newspaper pages, or the occasional teacup clink gave proof of life. And then distinctly came the footsteps. Not hurried, not timid. These were deliberate heavy strides that echoed unnaturally loud in the narrow hallway. Miss Wren stilled her hands, the yarn slipping unnoticed into her lap, and tilted her head. The steps halted just outside room 9, a room she had heard the receptionist declare, more than once, to be sealed for repairs. There was a pause, then the unmistakable click of a key turning in an old lock, followed by silence so complete it made her ears ring. Moving with practiced stealth, she pushed her door open just enough to see nothing. The corridor appeared deserted, yet the door to room 9 now stood ajar, its darkness a void that seemed to pull at the edges of her mind. No one emerged. After a tense beat, the door creaked shut of its own accord, as though guided by invisible fingers. With her interest now fully piqued, Miss Wren gently closed her door and settled into bed, though she kept one ear tuned to every creak and whisper of the old inn. She slept in short bursts, each time awakening with the uncanny sense that something was watching. Just before dawn the silence shattered. A scream high and raw tore through the morning calm, scattering seagulls and jolting every guest awake. By the time Miss Wren had donned her robe and stepped into the hallway, a crowd had begun to form, their faces pale in the grey morning light, eyes wide with a blend of fear and excitement. "Room 9, gasped the chambermaid, her face ashen, her apron crumpled in trembling fists. "There's a man. He's dead, I think." The inn's usual stillness was replaced with murmurs, gasps and wild theories. Miss Wren, composed but sharp-eyed, edged closer. Inside the room, sprawled awkwardly across the narrow bed, lay a man of indeterminate age, his clothes disheveled, hair damp as if from rain, and in his lifeless hand, clutched with such desperate intensity, it seemed he had died trying to keep it hidden, was a tarnished silver locket, its chain broken, its back engraved with something too faint to read at a glance. No one recognized him. "Not one of ours," whispered Miss Bellamy, the owner's wife, wringing her hands. "I know every guest by name. But this man, I've never seen him before." "But how did he even get in?" exclaimed another voice. "That room's been locked for weeks." Miss Wren said nothing, but her mind was already ticking. A man dead in a sealed room, holding a personal item that didn't belong. This was no accident. This was a message. By breakfast the dining hall buzzed like a hive of disturbed bees, guests whispering behind menus, casting glances across tables, their usual small talk replaced by anxious theories. Mr. Langford, a retired solicitor with a reputation for discretion, looked unnaturally pale, his cutlery untouched. Miss Everleigh, known for her nightly walks, was oddly quiet, her eyes fixed on her teacup. Mrs. Havisham, always loud and loud-dressed, laughed too quickly and too often. Something was off. Miss Wren could feel it. These weren't the reactions of people surprised by a stranger's death. No, this was the tension of secrets long buried now threatening to claw their way to the surface. And in her long years of observation, Miss Wren had learned that in quiet places like this, the dead don't just arrive, they are summoned. That morning, as the sky outside hung low with a curtain of mist, and the salty breeze from the sea whispered along the windowsills of the Royal Albion, Miss Elspeth Rowley sat quietly in the dining hall, her porridge untouched and cooling, though her spoon stirred it with slow, deliberate motions as if her hands needed to pretend, while her mind worked furiously beneath her composed exterior. Around her, the murmur of hushed conversation rippled through the room like an undertow, restrained, watchful, and frayed with a tension too thick to ignore. Faces betrayed far more than words ever could. There were those whose eyes darted toward the hallway, each time the door creaked open, those who spoke a little too loudly in an attempt to appear unaffected, and then, most telling of all, those like Mr. Harrington, whose trembling fingers gripped his teacup so tightly his knuckles had gone white, eyes locked on his plate, as though it might reveal a way out. Miss Elspeth, never one to leap before observing the water's depth, quietly classified them. The ones who knew something, the ones who desperately wanted to know, and the rare few who knew far too much and were doing everything in their power to hide it. Later she wandered into the lounge, where Mrs. Bexley, whose usual cheer had evaporated, was straightening the floral cushions with an almost frantic energy, each puff of air from them sounding like a suppressed scream. "Such an awful affair," Miss Elspeth said gently, her voice soft as silk yet lined with steel. "But of course these sorts of disruptions do happen, even in the most reputable establishments." Mrs. Bexley's laugh was brittle, her smile a poorly fastened mask. "No, no, not here. We've been family-run for 3 decades without a single incident. This is just a mix-up. A strange man in room 9. That room's been locked for renovations. There's black mold. No guest should have had access." Her voice pitched slightly at the end, and her fingers twisted the hem of her blouse unconsciously, like a marionette pulled by nerves. Miss Elspeth offered a calm nod but said nothing of how she had already noticed the faint mark of dustless fingerprints on the handle of room 9 just that morning. By afternoon the old naval man Mr. Braith, cheeks flushed from a generous helping of brandy and wartime pride, drew her into his favorite corner chair, and whispered through boozy breath about a figure he'd seen just past midnight. "Didn't walk like a guest," he muttered. "Slipped through the corridor like a whisper, long coat dragging behind, didn't hear a step, not one. Like they floated, and the smell clove tobacco. Strong, my captain used to smoke that. You never forget it, not after the war." He shook his head, as though trying to dislodge the image, but Miss Elspeth leaned back, her eyes gleaming with interest. That same scent had clung faintly to the stairwell banister this morning. almost masked by lemon polish, but not quite. Later still, in the parlor, Mrs. Danvers, the type of woman who thrived on teetering between melodrama and clairvoyance, delivered her report to anyone who'd listen, her eyes wide, voice hushed. 3 knocks. At precisely 1:03 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. I know what I heard. Not a dream. Not the wind. And someone humming, just for a moment. Low and slow, like a lullaby. Her fingers clutched her shawl, knuckles white against the paisley fringe. Miss Elspeth simply nodded, knitting slowly, but her mind was already racing. Mrs. Danvers had always been prone to embellishment, but buried beneath the theatrics was often a speck of unsettling truth. Then came the truly peculiar bit, revealed not by words, but by what was omitted. The window to room 9, found this morning slightly ajar from the inside, despite a violent storm that had battered the coast all night. No footprints in the damp hallway carpet. No sign of entry or exit, just that faint chill in the air, the smell of old smoke, and the inexplicable knowledge that someone or something had been there. And as the shadows stretched longer across the patterned carpet, and the guests began exchanging nervous glances instead of pleasantries, Miss Elspeth watched it all unfold, quietly piecing together the puzzle behind her serene expression. When Mr. Harrington rose too abruptly from his chair, nearly forgetting his walking stick, and cast a furtive glance toward the darkened window, as if fearing or expecting a visitor, Miss Elspeth allowed herself a faint smile. The storm may have passed, but its echo lingered in every whisper, every glance, every shiver. The game had already begun, and she was no longer just a guest at the Royal Albion. She was the only one who saw the board clearly. That morning, as a thick fog clung low to the coastline, and the crashing of waves echoed like distant warnings against the cliffs, Miss Agatha Wynne, known in quieter circles for her uncanny ability to notice what others missed, observed the other guests from her corner seat in the solarium of the Seafoam Inn, her tea growing steadily cold, while her eyes moved with the quiet precision of a hawk. Mr. Lowell, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers and an apologetic smile, sat 3 chairs away, pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. Though his eyes hadn't moved past the same line in nearly 10 minutes. He flinched slightly when she spoke, her voice soft and kindly. Terrible news about the man in room 8. Though I imagine a gentleman like yourself has witnessed far worse in your day. Mr. Lowell blinked, then chuckled nervously, fingers twitching against the frayed corner of the newsprint. I keep to myself mostly, he mumbled. Came here for the quiet, you know. Naturally, Agatha said, stirring her tea with slow, deliberate circles. Though it is curious, wouldn't you say? A man found dead in a locked room no one was meant to occupy, with no sign of forced entry, and no name to match the face. His smile wilted. Later that afternoon, she wandered past the narrow, dim corridor leading to room 8, the scent of sandalwood still faint in the air, despite the open window, and the housekeeper's best attempts to scrub the air clean. The body, when she'd glimpsed it earlier, had one hand curled around an object, a fountain pen, peculiar in design, silver inlay, the sort reserved for gift-giving, not everyday use. The soles of the man's shoes were coated in dried salt and dust, as though he'd walked in from a storm that never happened, and yet there was no record of his arrival, no name in the guest log, and no one had seen him enter. Curious still was the wet trail near the baseboard, that stopped halfway into the room and vanished entirely. No footsteps, no smear, as though whoever brought him here had simply disappeared. The inn's young attendant, Elsie, barely able to hide her morbid fascination, brought the guest ledger at Miss Wynne's polite request, flipping to the page for the previous night with wide eyes. He's not here, she whispered. Room 8 wasn't even assigned. Agatha's gaze ran steadily over the names. Mr. Lowell in room 10, the Lanes in room 6, herself in room 7. The blank line for room 8 stood out like a missing tooth. Odd, she said softly. So very odd. That evening, the drawing room was thick with low murmurs and darting eyes. Grantham, always eager to share what she happened to notice, leaned in over her embroidery, with a conspiratorial tilt of her head. "They say the poor man had no luggage," she whispered. "And no key. How does a man arrive without a key to his room?" Her voice dropped further. "And then there's the humming. Heard it myself. Around 2 in the morning. Low and tuneless, like someone remembering a song from a dream." Agatha made no reply, but her mind quietly filed away every detail. At precisely 1:47 a.m., her clock had chimed just as she'd heard a faint creak in the hallway, and a shadow drift beneath the crack of her door. Too brief to follow, too slow to be accidental. The guests had begun talking now, not in sentences, but in fragments and glances about the room that hadn't been rented in years. About the widow who'd vanished from room 8 last winter, and was never found. About the way the lock had jammed when the staff tried to open it that morning. It was Miss Wynne alone who noticed the portrait hanging outside the room had been turned slightly, just enough to reveal the faint smudge of ash behind it. No one could remember who the portrait was of. No one ever did. And as the sea wind picked up again that night, and the light flickered over the hallway carpets, she sat quietly with her knitting and her thoughts, knowing full well that some rooms are never truly empty, and that some guests arrive not by foot or train, but through secrets left unfinished, and sometimes, those secrets are already inside before anyone notices the door has opened. Later that morning, Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, couldn't help but notice the air of tension in the room when she found Mrs. Sandford hunched over the ledger, her fingers nervously brushing the edges, as though she might erase the entire debacle with a single stroke. The sigh that escaped Mrs. Sandford's lips was heavy with regret. "Such a dreadful misunderstanding," she murmured, her voice tinged with both sorrow and frustration. "If only we'd known." "Known what, dear?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft, drawing out the question with deliberate curiosity. Mrs. Sandford hesitated, glancing up at Miss Marple with a troubled expression. "It's the rooms, you see," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "A last-minute change of plans, 2 guests cancelled, and then another party insisted on adjoining rooms. It must have been the night porter who made the mistake. Room 13 was never meant to be occupied at all." Miss Marple paused, her knitting needles momentarily still as she processed the information, letting it hang in the air like a faint scent. "And the man who died?" she asked, her tone gentle, almost coaxing. Mrs. Sandford's voice dropped even further, as though she feared the very mention of it would summon something dark. "That's just it," she said, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "He wasn't even on the register. No luggage, no booking, no trace of him anywhere. It was as if he simply materialized out of thin air." Miss Marple, her brow furrowing slightly, looked down at her knitting, the needles moving again with slow, deliberate precision. "Or perhaps he was searching for someone else's room altogether," she mused softly, her words almost lost in the rhythmic clicking of her needles. Mrs. Sandford's eyes widened in shock, the blood draining from her face. You don't think," she stammered, her voice a mix of disbelief and fear. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unblinking as she fixed her gaze on the older woman. "Sometimes, the wrong person opens the wrong door, and that can lead to all sorts of complications," she said, her voice smooth and calm, though the weight of her words made the room feel colder. She folded her knitting neatly, her mind already shifting toward the next line of inquiry. "Who precisely was room 13 meant for?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like an invitation. It was at that moment Gladys entered, her arms laden with fresh linen, her face flushed with excitement, as if she had just uncovered a great secret. "Funny thing," she began, her voice light but carrying an undercurrent of gossip. "There was a telegram for room 13, but it was misdelivered to the wrong tray." Miss Marple's knitting slowed once more, her hand stilling as she gave Gladys her full attention. "And who was the telegram for?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual. Gladys leaned closer, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of the drama. "Just the initial M. That's all it said," she replied, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. Mrs. Sandford was terribly flustered about it. She insisted it must have been an old mistake, maybe from years ago. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, her knitting forgotten as she considered the implications of what had been said. People she knew often insisted that things were mistakes when they were simply too terrified to confront the truth. And the message itself? Miss Marple asked, her voice light but probing. Gladys shrugged nonchalantly. Oh, the usual sort of thing, she said breezily. Urgent. Must speak immediately. Nothing unusual. Though why anyone would be so desperate to contact someone at the Royal Gull, I can't imagine. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened as she regarded Gladys, the wheels in her mind turning with a quiet, steady precision. Ah, but I can imagine, my dear, Miss Marple replied softly. She had seen these sorts of messages before. They were rarely about anything pleasant. More often than not, they were the final thread in a tapestry of blackmail, fear or desperation, carefully woven together with lies. The mystery of the telegram's intended recipient began to gnaw at Miss Marple's mind. Who could the mysterious mem be? What was it that they had been so desperate to communicate? As the morning progressed, Miss Marple sought out Colonel Denby, who was lounging in the sunroom, half dozing with a copy of the Times draped across his chest. The rays of the sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows over his face. He stirred as she entered, blinking rapidly, as though startled from a troubling dream. Awful business, he said immediately, his voice heavy with unease. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, settling into the chair beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Dreadful indeed, she agreed, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes twinkling with a quiet intensity. And so very mysterious, don't you think? The Colonel cleared his throat, his attempt at nonchalance failing as he straightened in his chair, as though eager to appear important. I expect you heard. I saw someone last night. Only whispers, of course, he added, as though his words were a great revelation. Miss Marple's voice was low, her tone coaxing as she gently encouraged him to speak. Tall, I'd say, wearing one of those long cloaks, almost theatrical, like something out of an old-fashioned drama. The Colonel hesitated, his brow furrowing in thought before he nodded slowly. Yes, that's right, but I'd had a bit of whiskey by then, so I'm not sure I saw as clearly as I thought. Miss Marple smiled politely, her gaze steady. How very understandable, she said, her voice soft and reassuring. Yet, in her mind the pieces were falling into place. The cloak, the telegram, the mysterious figure. It was all too much to be mere coincidence. Still, a cloak is rather a dramatic choice, isn't it? Miss Marple added thoughtfully, her words carrying an unspoken weight, almost like a disguise. The Colonel, eager to maintain his air of authority, nodded sagely, though Miss Marple knew he had no idea how close he had come to unraveling the truth. She, however, was already tying the cloak, the telegram, and the mysterious events of Room 13 into a delicate thread that led to something far more dangerous than anyone had yet realized. The mystery, it seemed, was only just beginning. The evening settled quietly around the Royal Gull, its creaking wooden floors and gently flickering candles offering little respite from the building sense of unease that seemed to grow with each passing hour. In the midst of it all, Miss Marple continued her knitting, her fingers moving with rhythmic precision as the murmurs of gossip swirled around her like the very threads she worked. The guests, their faces lined with anticipation, gathered in small clusters throughout the parlor, whispering among themselves. The grand clock in the corner ticked with a slow, deliberate beat, each tick bringing them closer to some untold truth that none yet dared to speak. Mrs. Sandford, for all her poised exterior, could not seem to quiet the anxious flutter of her hands, her knuckles pale from the tight grip on the edge of her teacup. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle signs, the unease, the discomfort in her eyes that hinted at a secret far more weighty than the mere change of rooms. You think me foolish, Miss Marple, Mrs. Sandford said at last, her voice wavering. But it's not right, the way things turned out. That man, he wasn't even on the register, he didn't pay his bill. She stopped abruptly, as if the words were caught in her throat, unwilling to emerge. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, calm and kind as she placed her knitting down with deliberate slowness. Her voice, soft yet unyielding, carried the weight of experience. And this man, Mrs. Sandford. How did he come to stay in room 13? The very mention of the number sent a ripple of discomfort through the room, and Mrs. Sandford's fingers tightened around the cup. "I can't explain it, Miss Marple," she muttered, her voice low. "The whole thing was unusual. They say he didn't even leave the room until the morning. And then he was gone." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her lips slightly parted as she digested the details. It was always in the quiet gaps, the moments between spoken words, that the most telling details revealed themselves. "And his belongings?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Gone as well, I imagine." Mrs. Sandford's face twisted in confusion, before a shadow of realization passed over her. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "His case vanished, as if he never existed at all. It's unsettling, almost unnatural." There it was, the subtle clue that Miss Marple had been waiting for. She knew it all too well. When people began to disappear, as if by magic, it often meant they had never truly belonged. Or worse, they were meant to vanish. The conversation was abruptly interrupted as Mrs. Whittaker swept into the room, her eager eyes gleaming with the promise of more gossip. "Oh, Miss Marple, you simply must hear what I saw last night," she exclaimed, practically bubbling with excitement. Miss Marple smiled politely, though her attention shifted. She had already learned to wait for the second, quieter round of information, the one that often came after the dramatic flourishes of the first. Mrs. Whittaker leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "After my cocoa, of course I pulled the curtains back and saw a woman." She paused dramatically, allowing the suspense to hang between them. A woman in a dark cloak, sweeping out of the side door of the hotel. It was so peculiar, Miss Marple, so very odd. Miss Marple's eyes remained unreadable, but her mind whirred, sorting through the implications. "Did you see her face?" she asked, her tone soft, careful. Mrs. Whittaker shook her head, her expression turning conspiratorial. "No, no. Her hood was pulled so tightly that I couldn't make out a single feature. It was the strangest thing. No one else here dresses like that." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers slowly picking up the knitting once more, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. "How very interesting," she murmured, almost to herself, as Mrs. Whittaker settled back in her chair, eager for more attention. Miss Marple was already mulling over the implications of the cloaked figure, a ghost from the past, or someone deliberately hiding in plain sight. As the evening progressed, the whispers and stories grew, feeding off each other like flames in a dry forest. But Miss Marple's focus had shifted once again, her mind already working behind the scenes. She moved discreetly, unnoticed, to the back hall, where the real stories were born. Not in the lounge or parlor, where all the social facades were displayed, but in the quiet corners where the staff gathered. Between the racks of coats and forgotten bags, the chambermaids, Gladys and Eddie, were deep in conversation, their voices low but tinged with a certain nervousness. "That room, Eddie," Gladys was saying, her voice carrying an almost superstitious fear. "There's something wrong with it. It's never been right. I swear it's unlucky." Eddie, folding napkins without hurry, looked around, her eyes wide. "I've heard the stories. They say no one who stays there stays long, and nothing good ever comes from it. It's like the room itself doesn't want anyone in it." Miss Marple, ever the picture of politeness, bent down to adjust her shoe, a quiet excuse to linger nearby. "The last time, you mean?" she asked casually, as if she had wandered into the conversation by chance. Gladys looked nervously over her shoulder, her voice dropping to a mere whisper. "Don't say too much, Miss Marple, but I'm telling you, it's cursed. People go in, but they never come out the same." Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly, taking in the weight of their words. "And what happened the last time?" she asked, her tone light, giving nothing away. "Some say a man stayed there," Gladys muttered, "and the next morning, well, he was gone, vanished, without a trace, no luggage, no bill paid." Just gone. Miss Marple's expression never changed, but her mind was already assembling the pieces. The room, the cloaked figure, the unexplained disappearance. These things were not mere coincidence. They were clues, intricate and deliberate. Later, as the evening wore on, and the night's chill began to settle, a soft knock came at Miss Marple's door. It was Gladys again, her face flushed with a mixture of guilt and excitement. "Miss Marple," she began, glancing nervously around. "I think you ought to know about room 13. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet interest, as she folded her hands waiting. "This isn't the first time something's happened there," Gladys continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, long before I started here, a gentleman stayed in that room, and one morning," she faltered, taking a deep breath, "he was just gone. No trace, no explanation." Miss Marple's voice was calm, but the weight of her words was heavy. "Gone?" she repeated softly. "Without a trace?" Gladys nodded solemnly. "Some say he walked into the room, and never walked out." Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together the fragments of information. The strange disappearance, the cloaked figure, the chilling whispers of the staff. It was all connected, each thread weaving a darker story. Something, or someone, was hiding in the shadows, and Miss Marple was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. The early morning at the Royal Gull was shrouded in an eerie stillness, a quiet that seemed almost unnatural, as though the very air was holding its breath in anticipation. Miss Marple sat by the window, her eyes tracing the tranquil beauty of the garden, where dew-laden petals sparkled under the delicate light of the rising sun. Despite the serene view, there was an unsettling undercurrent to the day, a feeling that something was amiss, something that had been set into motion long before dawn. Miss Marple, whose sharp mind had long been attuned to the smallest shift in atmosphere, was certain that the events unfolding at the hotel were far from ordinary. The strange figure cloaked in shadow, slipping past the hotel in the dead of night, the man who had vanished from room 13 without a trace, the dark whispers that circulated behind closed doors. All these threads began to weave a picture she could no longer ignore. She knew all too well that when an intricate puzzle began to form, it often meant a dangerous truth was lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. As her knitting needles rested idle in her lap, contemplating the weight of her thoughts, the tranquil morning was abruptly interrupted by a cry, a sharp scream that sent the hotel staff into a flurry of motion. Mr. Pritchard, the aloof and seemingly immovable hotel manager, had been found. His body was sprawled awkwardly on the damp grass behind the stone wall that bordered the garden, his face turned toward the earth, one hand twisted grotesquely beneath him. His once pristine jacket was half pulled from his shoulder, and a dark bruise was already forming on his temple, a testament to the violent impact he had endured. The sight of his bent and broken glasses lying just beside him only served to deepen the sense of dread that hung over the scene. Within moments, the hotel was in complete turmoil, the staff running about in a blind panic, with Mrs. Sandiford wringing her hands and Colonel Denby offering the most medically questionable advice, including the suggestion of brandy to revive the victim. Amid the chaos, Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her gaze cool and observant. She was accustomed to such scenes. People often got lost in the frenzy of the moment, their minds clouded with panic, missing the subtle clues that would reveal the true nature of events. As the guests and staff scurried around, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the grass-stained cuff of Mr. Pritchard's sleeve. The neatness of an accidental fall had never appeared so carefully planned. There was a deliberate quality to it, a calculated fall that was too precise to be a mere mishap. Kneeling beside the body with an air of practiced calm, Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm as she called out, "Mr. Pritchard, can you hear me?" There was no reply, only the faintest rise and fall of his chest beneath his crumpled shirt. It was then that Gladys, the chambermaid, appeared with a linen basket, her scream slicing through the air as she saw the lifeless form of the manager. The hotel descended into further madness, with people rushing to and fro, attempting to organize the situation. But Miss Marple remained by the body, her expression serene as ever. It was in the midst of the commotion that she spotted it. A small crumpled piece of paper, half hidden in the inner pocket of Mr. Pritchard's jacket. Her gloved fingers reached out with a delicate precision, slipping the paper free before anyone could notice. As the doctor arrived, offering his usual solemn diagnoses and unnecessary remedies, Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She had already turned her attention to the photograph that had been tucked away in her mind for days. It was an old image, worn and yellowed with time, showing two men standing side by side in the sunlight. One was unmistakably Mr. Pritchard, though younger, with more hair, and a thinner frame. But the other man, whose face was obscured by shadow, remained a mystery. Who was he? And why did Mr. Pritchard look so strangely tense in his company? As the hotel buzzed with idle speculation, Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the puzzle that lay before her. The sinister reputation of Room 13, the strange disappearances, the mysterious cloaked figure. Everything was beginning to fit into place. Miss Marple had long known that human nature, with its many shades of greed, fear, love and guilt, often held the key to solving the most complex mysteries. The more she listened to the whispers and polite lies, the more certain she became. There was someone inside the hotel who had known exactly who Mr. Pritchard was, and more importantly, who had reason to fear his presence. There was nothing accidental about his fall. It was a calculated act, designed to send a message. The true question was, what did Mr. Pritchard know? What had he come to find in Room 13? And why had it cost him his life? As the morning unfolded, Miss Marple could already see the dark shape of the truth emerging from the shadows. She was no stranger to the feeling that something had been set into motion long before anyone had noticed. Before the first whispers of gossip had even begun. She could already sense that the answer lay hidden within the past, buried under layers of deception and forgotten histories. Someone had been hiding something, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, one quiet step at a time. The hotel's secrets were about to be revealed, and Miss Marple would ensure that no detail, no matter how small, went unnoticed. The morning at the Grand Havens was as eerily quiet as the calm before a storm, the kind of silence that settles over a place when it knows something is about to break. Miss Marple, always alert to the smallest change in the air, sat in her favorite chair by the window, knitting needles in hand. But her mind was far from the yarn and threads she was working with. She was focused on the photograph she had found earlier, the one she had almost overlooked. It was an old weathered picture of two men standing side by side, one of them unmistakably Mr. Pritchard, but the other, the second man, was a shadow, a figure whose face was obscured. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the air of familiarity between the two men wasn't one of friendship or mutual respect, but something deeper, darker, an unspoken bond of shared guilt or perhaps shared fear. The kind of fear that doesn't fade, no matter how many years pass, and certainly not when it's rooted in something long buried. As Miss Marple folded the photograph and tucked it away, she couldn't help but reflect on the fact that no one could truly outrun the past. It always caught up with you, like a shadow that stretched longer and longer, until there was nowhere to hide. When she rose from her seat, her movements were slow, deliberate, and purposeful. As she made her way to Mr. Pritchard's room, there was something she needed to hear from him, something buried beneath the layers of polite conversation and thinly veiled concern. Mr. Pritchard, lying in his bed, propped against a mound of pillows, seemed so fragile in that moment. His face was pale, almost the color of cold tea, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the blanket. When Miss Marple gently patted his sleeve, her voice soft and caring, it was clear that she wasn't just offering comfort. There, Mr. Pritchard," she murmured. "You gave us all quite a fright." He let out a weak laugh, but it caught in his throat, like he was struggling against something more than just illness. "Foolish of me," he said, his voice raspy. "Bit of a dizzy spell." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between them as her fingers moved methodically, tidying up the edges of the blanket. It was a gesture that appeared comforting, but was in fact a subtle invitation for him to speak more. "They'll come back, Mr. Pritchard murmured, his voice so quiet. It almost blended with the soft rustle of the curtains in the breeze. Miss Marple's hands paused for just a moment, but only just. "Who will, dear?" she asked, her tone gentle but insistent. But his eyes fluttered shut, leaving the question unanswered, hanging in the stale air like a forgotten echo. Later, when Miss Marple returned to her room, she sat down, her fingers steepled together in quiet contemplation. She had seen that kind of fear before. It wasn't the kind that came from someone caught in a lie, or the terror of a scandal waiting to unfold. No, this was older, deeper, and far more dangerous. It was the kind of fear that people carried with them for years, hidden in their pockets like a secret, waiting for the day it would come back to demand its price. She felt a small quiet satisfaction as she folded her hands and allowed the pieces of the puzzle to fall into place. There was still much she didn't know, but now, she understood one thing with certainty. This wasn't just an accident. This was far from the result of a simple quarrel. No, this was something far more sinister, something buried in the past, something that had never truly stayed buried. Whatever had been hidden, whatever Mr. Pritchard had uncovered or feared, Miss Marple could already feel it stirring beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. As she sat in the quiet of her room, a particular silence began to spread through the hotel, a silence she knew well from her many years of observation. It was the silence that crept in when people were aware of something, a truth perhaps, but were afraid to speak it, to let it escape into the open. That evening, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she noticed that her window, which she had distinctly remembered closing, was now slightly ajar. A small thing perhaps, but small things were rarely accidents in her experience. As she sat in her chair, brushing her hair, there came a soft tap at her door. Too soft, too delicate to be any of the staff or guests. Miss Marple said nothing, waiting in the stillness, the sound of the retreating footsteps almost too faint to catch. There it was, the shift. From being the quiet observer, Miss Marple had now unknowingly become the target of someone's attention. The realization settled over her like a heavy blanket, but she knew one thing for certain. The past, no matter how much it had been concealed, was never content to remain silent, and whoever was hiding in the shadows of the Grand Havens knew that Miss Marple was getting too close to the truth. Miss Marple sat in the corner of the dimly lit parlor, her fingers wrapped around the delicate handle of her teacup, but her eyes scanning the room as if the walls themselves were whispering forgotten secrets. The Royal Gull had stood for decades, its quiet elegance, a mere facade, hiding beneath it a history that seemed to resist the passage of time. She had known something was amiss from the moment she stepped inside. It wasn't the misplaced photograph, or the hushed voices at dinner. It was the tension thick enough to taste, hanging in the air like the weight of a long-forgotten sin. The guests moved in patterns, their eyes avoiding hers as if her presence was enough to reveal the fragile cracks in their carefully constructed lives. Miss Marple's smile remained polite, serene yet behind it, her mind worked relentlessly, stitching together pieces of a puzzle no one else seemed willing to see. As she sipped her tea, the name George Marsden slipped through her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't shake, an echo of something darker from the past. She had heard the whispers, smuggling, betrayal, a missing woman, and now here she was, sitting in the very place where it all began, with a corpse in room 13 to seal the story. Her quiet conversations with the staff revealed more than they intended, each word adding weight to the heavy truth that hovered just out of reach. The vicar's sister had been too eager to share tales of wartime secrecy, of strangers in the night, and packages that arrived and vanished under the cover of darkness. A strange man, Marsden, had lingered in the hotel for far too long, and then one day, had simply walked into the sea. Or so they said. But there was always more, always another layer hidden beneath the surface, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that people who buried their secrets were rarely quiet for long. The telegram from Scotland Yard confirmed what she had already suspected. George Marsden was no victim of the sea. He had been murdered. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and the story was no longer one of wartime smuggling and whispered rumors. It was a tale of old debts, betrayals, and a final reckoning. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the door, as the soft tap-tap of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The past was never really gone. Not when people like Marsden left their mark on the world. As she folded her hands in her lap, she knew that someone, perhaps more than one, was beginning to realize that the quiet, unassuming lady in room 12 had seen far more than anyone had ever hoped. The silence in the hotel deepened, and Miss Marple's calm exterior hid a mind that had already pieced together a tale more tangled than anyone could have imagined. She was ready, and the past, with all its ghosts, was finally prepared to reveal itself. Miss Marple's hands moved with practiced precision, her knitting clicking softly as she kept her attention fixed on the quiet murmur of the conversation around her. The news of the body in room 13 hadn't been a surprise to her. No, not at all. The ghost of the past had walked back into that room like an old friend, reminding the living that some things could never truly be forgotten. She studied the constable's face as he spoke of the drowned man George Marsden, who was presumed lost to the sea after the war. But in truth, he hadn't drowned at all. He had simply disappeared, just like the man who had once managed the hotel, her husband's family's pride and joy. She smiled gently, her expression as calm as ever, though behind her serene exterior, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with unnerving clarity. It was clear now. The tragedy of room 13 was far from over, and someone, still very much alive, had been quietly aware of its unfinished business. Later, over tea with Mrs. Sandiford, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the tremor in her companion's fingers as she carefully folded her napkin. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "Such a dreadful business, isn't it?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, as though simply stating the obvious, but there was something deeper in her tone, something knowing. Mrs. Sandiford's lips tightened, and Miss Marple continued, "You must feel very connected to the hotel, having seen it through so many changes." The woman's smile was tight, her eyes briefly distant as she replied, "It belonged to my husband's family. He took it over before the war, though of course that was a difficult time." The conversation drifted like the tea in their cups, but Miss Marple's mind remained fixed on the shadows that clung to Mrs. Sandiford's words. She allowed a moment of silence to stretch before gently pressing further. "And your husband? Did he go far when the war took its toll?" The woman's hands trembled as she poured, her eyes avoiding Miss Marple's. "He stayed. To help," he said. "Someone had to keep the business running. And then, one day he just vanished." The room seemed to grow colder as the words hung in the air. "Vanished," Miss Marple repeated, her voice low, as if savoring the mystery. "Walked out, they said. Took a boat maybe. But no one really knew for sure," Mrs. Sandiford added, her smile brittle. "Some said it had to do with smuggling. But that's nonsense. He wasn't that sort." Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, simply allowing the silence to deepen. She had seen enough to know that everyone had their secrets, even the most outwardly respectable. "You never heard from him again?" she asked softly, her hands still, her knitting forgotten. Mrs. Sandiford's voice tightened. "Not a word." As Miss Marple sat there, contemplating the mystery before her, she sensed that the story of room 13 was only beginning to reveal its darkest truths. That evening, as she found herself seated next to Colonel Denby, nursing a second brandy, she ventured further into the past. "You must have known the hotel during the war, Colonel," she said lightly, her knitting back in hand, but her eyes sharp. The Colonel gave a non-committal grunt, his mustache twitching. "Came through a few times," he muttered, clearly uninterested in the topic. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice smooth and unhurried. "Odd comings and goings, I imagine. Secret meetings, discreet arrangements." The Colonel's mustache bristled, and he cleared his throat. "Nothing improper, of course," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course," she agreed, "but I suspect not everyone was so careful with their discretion." The Colonel shifted uncomfortably, then lowered his voice. "Some fellows, well, they had arrangements, black market goods, side business, things like that." His words were matter of fact, But Miss Marple heard the unspoken confession within them. "Smuggling, you mean?" she said gently, her tone never wavering. The colonel flushed, but did not deny it. "Yes, something like that." Miss Marple's mind whirred, piecing the fragmented details together. She already knew room 13 had never truly been empty. It had merely been waiting, quietly, for someone to come and claim what was owed. The crisp, early morning air seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple sat in the lounge, the soft clink of her knitting needles, a rhythm in the silence. The haunting thought of Mrs. Sandiford's disappearance still lingered. But it was no surprise. Miss Marple had long ago learned that the past never truly dies. It only waits patiently until the right moment arrives. Mrs. Sandiford had run, no doubt with the weight of her secrets pushing her into the night. But it was not the flight of the guilty that intrigued Miss Marple. It was the identity of the innocent whom Mrs. Sandiford had so desperately tried to protect. The letter, stained and trembling in Mrs. Sandiford's grasp, was clear. Please protect the innocent. But who was this innocent? And why did Mrs. Sandiford believe the weight of her actions could never be lifted? With quiet precision, Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it beside her knitting. There was no panic in her demeanor, no rush to act. She had learned that the truth would always surface in time, and when it did, it would be even more dangerous than the secrets that sought to keep it hidden. She had already deduced that the crime in room 13 was no accident. It was a reckoning that had been waiting for years to unfold. Later, as the day wore on, Colonel Denby, ever the blustering fool, delivered the forgotten handbag, a small but significant clue in this puzzle. The bag was worn, its clasp struggling to stay closed. Much like the memories Miss Marple had unearthed in the past days. No one vanishes without a trace. No one runs from their ghosts alone. The clumsy revelation by Colonel Denby only served to reinforce the inevitable. There was more to this than met the eye. And in the dead of night, when the hotel was cloaked in darkness, someone was bound to step into that room again. Someone who had left behind more than just a forgotten handbag. Miss Marple had a theory, and she was about to test it, though her quiet smile betrayed no hint of the danger that loomed in the shadows. The walls of the Royal Gull had seen it all: smuggling, betrayal, and lies. But this time, Miss Marple would be the one to unravel the final thread, even if the truth led her to an unexpected and dangerous conclusion. As she opened the bag and sifted through its contents, she already knew someone in this hotel had a secret that had festered for far too long, and they would stop at nothing to bury it again. But Miss Marple's patience had always been her greatest weapon. She would wait, and when the time was right, the last of the ghosts would be put to rest. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the contents of the worn handbag, each item a clue left behind in a hurry. A handkerchief embroidered with SS, the faintest trace of forgotten histories, a tin of peppermints, nearly empty, the scent of old comfort still lingering in the air, and at the bottom, buried beneath these ordinary trinkets, a small key ring caught her attention. Among the several innocuous keys, one stood out, a master key, tarnished with age, its brass tag etched with a single damning word: Room 13. She held it for a moment, her mind working quickly, piecing together fragments of an old, unfinished story. This was no ordinary key. It wasn't the key to Mrs. Sandiford's room, nor to any part of her life here. It was the key to the past, to a room steeped in memories of wartime secrets and forgotten dangers. For a brief instant, Miss Marple felt the weight of history in her hand, the same history that had brought George Marsden back to this place, to room 13, not to revisit lost memories, but to confront someone from his past, someone whose fate had been sealed long ago. But Marsden had not met his intended target. Instead, he had walked into the wrong room, a room already occupied by Mr. Pritchard, a man with his own tangled wartime connections to Marsden. It had been a fatal mistake. Miss Marple's mind moved with the precision of a needle pulling through thread. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity, but of old fears resurfacing, gripping those who were still haunted by their pasts. The confusion, the misplaced room assignments, the mix-up over the telegram, all pointed to one chilling conclusion. The true target was never Pritchard, but someone else entirely. Someone Mrs. Sandiford had been trying so desperately to protect. Miss Marple knew, with a quiet certainty, that the wrong man had been killed, and the right one, whoever he was still out there. A second, deliberate crime was waiting to happen, unless she could stop it. The next morning, she met Mrs. Whittaker for tea, her demeanor serene, her words gentle as she guided the conversation toward memories long buried. Mrs. Whittaker, ever the picture of dramatic flair, spoke of the terror and uncertainty of the wartime years, of secrets kept hidden in the shadows. But Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and her questions pointed. She let the silence linger just long enough for Mrs. Whittaker to shift uncomfortably in her chair. That flicker of guilt, Miss Marple saw it, felt it. The woman was hiding something, and though she denied it with a hurried wave of her hand, Miss Marple knew better. The past had never truly passed. It was there just beneath the surface, waiting to return with a vengeance. And room 13, once a silent witness to betrayal and murder, was about to reveal its final secret. The key had unlocked the door to a puzzle years in the making, and Miss Marple was the only one who could piece it together before the darkness claimed another victim. The shadows of 30 years' worth of buried secrets seemed to stir as Miss Marple examined the tangled threads of a past that refused to stay hidden. The key to room 13, still clutched by someone too fearful to let go of old betrayals, had unlocked not just a door but a chain of events that could never be undone. The murder in room 13 wasn't a simple crime of passion or greed. It was the product of long-held festering fear. A fear so deep, it had driven someone to kill to silence a ghost, only to realize too late that the wrong ghost had been silenced entirely. Miss Marple understood, perhaps better than anyone, the terrible power of fear, how it could twist the mind, make people do unspeakable things in the grip of past terrors. But she knew better than to think that the killer would stop at just one crime. No, the real danger still loomed, and as the day crept forward, Miss Marple was determined to uncover the one person the killer still feared, the person whose very existence could bring the entire web of lies crashing down. That afternoon, Miss Marple gathered the suspects in the sitting room, her invitation written with such subtle politeness, it almost felt like a social gathering. Yet there was no mistaking the weight of what was to come. The guests arrived, their expressions a mixture of nervous curiosity and unease. Colonel Denby, stiff as always, stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, his posture like that of a man about to face a tribunal. Gladys lingered near the door, breathless with anticipation, while Mr. Pritchard sat rigidly, his eyes darting nervously from Miss Marple to the exit. Mrs. Whittaker, ever the picture of composure, settled in with an air of false serenity, though her fingers betrayed her with the anxious plucking of her sleeve. Miss Marple, calm as ever, settled into her chair, her knitting resting untouched in her lap, a picture of quiet authority. With a soft, almost tender voice, she began, "It is a dreadful thing, isn't it?" she murmured, her gaze sweeping over the room, when the past simply refuses to remain buried. Her words were gentle, yet there was an undeniable sharpness beneath them, like the hidden point of a needle in a cushion of wool. She paused, allowing her eyes to linger on each face in turn, before continuing. "Now that we've all had time to reflect," she said, "I believe it's time to speak plainly about what truly happened in room 13. There was no fanfare, no dramatic build-up, just a calm methodical unraveling of the truth, one carefully measured stitch at a time. It all begins," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze momentarily flicking to the empty chair, where Mrs. Sandiford should have been, with something that happened long ago during the war. She smoothed her skirt, her tone never faltering. Sandiford's husband, a man admired by many, was involved in certain activities that were far less respectable, smuggling, black market dealings, and I suspect the disappearance of a former associate. Her voice remained mild, but the certainty in it made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. "George Marsden," she continued, her eyes now locking on the startled faces of her audience. The man found dead in room 13 was one such associate. He knew exactly what Mrs. Sandiford's husband had been involved in, and he returned, not for revenge, but for profit. He came to blackmail her, knowing full well that she would pay any price to keep her late husband's reputation intact. Miss Marple paused, her fingers tapping gently on the armrest. But blackmailers, she continued, her tone soft but pointed, are rarely patient, and Mrs. Sandiford, already burdened by the weight of her husband's secrets, must have been desperate. She let the words settle in the air, heavy with implication. Desperation often leads to desperate mistakes, Miss Marple added quietly, glancing toward the staircase, where Mrs. Sandiford's absence was a silent presence in the room. And so, the first piece of the puzzle falls into place. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes never leaving her audience. But the most tragic part of all this, she continued, was the matter of room 13 itself. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it filled the room with a quiet intensity. You may remember a last-minute shuffle of room assignments, a small oversight, perhaps, or perhaps it was more deliberate than that. Her gaze shifted to Colonel Denby for just a moment, before returning to the others. In any case, the room George Marsden believed to be occupied by Mrs. Sandiford's confidant, her partner in past crimes, was in fact occupied by Mr. Pritchard. At the mention of his name, Mr. Pritchard visibly flinched, his teacup rattling in its saucer. Miss Marple gave him a kind, almost sympathetic smile. "You see," she said softly, "it wasn't Mr. Marsden's intended target who was killed." The words hung in the air, the silence stretching long and tense. Miss Marple let the truth settle like dust over the room. "No, Mr. Pritchard," she said, her voice now firm with the weight of revelation. "The wrong man was killed, and the killer in their panic made a fatal mistake." The room was still, the guests frozen in place as the full horror of their past, and the consequences of their actions began to unfold. The night hung heavy in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken truths, and Miss Marple, seated with her usual quiet composure, allowed the silence to envelop the room. The fire crackled softly, its warmth an eerie contrast to the chill that had settled over the gathering. The delicate dance of suspicion and fear was far from over, and Miss Marple's calm demeanor betrayed the intensity of what she was about to unravel. She observed each guest, the air thick with tension as their pasts collided with the present. The truth, long buried in the depths of secrets, was not merely a matter of greed, she knew. It was something far more insidious, something far older than any of them would admit. The murder of George Marsden was not a random act. It was a desperate attempt to silence a threat, one that had been brewing quietly for decades. The first thread to unravel, as Miss Marple knew all too well, was Mrs. Whittaker. Her eyes, once so composed, now flickered with an anxious energy, betraying the facade she had carefully constructed. The murder had not been her intention, but in the darkness of that night, her fear had clouded her judgment. She had acted out of love, misguided, yes, but love all the same, and in her desperation to protect a memory, she had become entangled in a web far more complex than she ever realized. Miss Marple's voice was a soft whisper, yet it cut through the room like a knife, revealing the truth that had been long hidden. Mrs. Whittaker's lover, a smuggler whose secrets could have destroyed her, had been the true target. But when Marsden had appeared in room 13, it was not her lover she had confronted but an innocent man. The wrong man had been murdered, and yet, Miss Marple noted, in some tragic sense, the right man had also met his end. For Mr. Pritchard, too, had his own skeletons in the closet, skeletons no one wished to acknowledge. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward him then, her eyes sharp as ever. The room grew colder still, and the guilt that had clung to everyone there seemed to press closer, suffocating them. The fire's crackle was the only sound that dared to break the silence, and Miss Marple continued to thread her way through the dark labyrinth of emotions, motives, and betrayal. She spoke softly but firmly, her words hanging in the air like a weight too heavy to ignore. Fear, she explained, was far more dangerous than greed. It consumed the mind, twisted even the most rational person, and made them do things they never thought possible. It was fear that had driven Mrs. Whittaker to murder, but it was also fear that had governed the lives of all present in that room. Fear of exposure, fear of scandal, and fear of the past coming to light. Miss Marple's voice softened as she spoke the final truth, the one they had all feared the most. It was not just George Marsden's return that had caused the fear, but the return of something far more terrifying. The ghosts of their own misdeeds, rising to demand retribution. Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, had slowly woven her way through the tangled web of lies and deceit, and now, as the truth stood exposed, she could finally rest. The guests, once so eager to uncover the murderer, were now left to face the far more uncomfortable truth, that the greatest threat of all was the fear that had driven them to commit the crime in the first place. By midday, the Royal Gull was quieter than before. The guests had resumed their routines, but there was an unmistakable shift in the air, a new awareness, a deeper understanding of what fear could make people do. Colonel Denby, his pride unscathed, was offering unsolicited lessons in cigar ash analysis to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Whittaker, pale but composed, sat quietly by the window, staring out at the sea with a faraway expression, her mind undoubtedly replaying the events that had shattered her life. Mr. Pritchard had withdrawn to his room, nursing a cup of tea, while Gladys, ever the gossip, eagerly shared the details of the night's revelations with anyone who would listen. Miss Marple, for her part, remained in the background, her knitting in her lap as she contemplated the delicate nature of human nature itself. She understood the power of fear, of love, and how the two intertwined to shape the darkest corners of the soul. But above all, she knew that in the end, no secret could remain buried forever, no matter how hard one tried to keep it hidden. Miss Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving with a rhythmic precision that masked the intensity of her thoughts. The world around her seemed to have returned to normal, after the shocking revelation of murder and betrayal. Yet, in the quiet hum of the room, there lingered a sensation of something not quite right, something untidy, as though the fabric of truth had a loose thread that needed to be pulled. In her years of experience, she knew that mysteries, much like knitting, were seldom without a final knot to untangle, no matter how neatly they seemed to have been resolved. As she patiently worked, her eyes momentarily lifted to observe Gladys, who appeared with a tea tray in hand, her breath coming in excited gasps. With wide eyes and a conspiratorial whisper, Gladys leaned in, her voice trembling with the thrill of the new information she was about to offer. "Miss Marple," she began, "I nearly forgot to mention, it's the key to Mrs. Sandford's room. She left it at the front desk the very night she vanished." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple's needles paused mid-air, her mind already spinning with the implications. It was the subtle yet revealing detail she had been waiting for, the type of clue that was far more telling than it first appeared. The key wasn't just a forgotten object, it had been deliberately left behind. Fear, Miss Marple knew, often led people to tidy up their mistakes, to erase any trace that could expose them, but in doing so, they left behind even deeper marks than fingerprints. Her curiosity piqued. Miss Marple nodded faintly, urging Gladys to continue. "And it was polished," Gladys added, almost like she didn't want anyone to see any fingerprints. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with recognition. This was no ordinary slip-up. A fearful person, as she well knew, might try to wipe away all signs of their panic, but the evidence remained stubbornly in plain sight. She asked if anyone had seen Mrs. Sandford leave, and Gladys shook her head. Not a soul, just the key, all shiny and strange, sitting there on the counter. Miss Marple, her knitting now forgotten, allowed herself a small smile. The room was still and quiet, yet within her, a flurry of thoughts whirled. She could see the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Moving with her usual understated grace, Miss Marple rose and made her way down the dim corridor, her gloved hand resting on the cool doorknob of Mrs. Sandford's room. The lack of luggage, the absence of departure arrangements, everything about the situation had been too controlled, too perfect. It was all a performance, one staged to deceive those who might have been watching. And now she was sure, the missing woman would be found, hiding not in fear of discovery, but in shame and pride. The service staircase, small and narrow, led her up to the hotel's attic, where few guests ventured. With one swift movement, Miss Marple lifted the latch and stepped inside. The dim light revealed the figure she had expected. Mrs. Sandford, curled up in the corner, clutching a weathered photograph of her long-dead husband. Her face, pale and drawn, betrayed the exhaustion of someone who had been running from her past for far too long. "Oh, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "You found me." And as Miss Marple stepped into the attic, closing the door softly behind her, she knew this was no longer a case of murder. It was the unraveling of a life built on secrets and fear, and in the end the truth, however tangled, always had a way of emerging, no matter how many threads were pulled. Miss Marple closed the door behind her with a quiet, almost reverential movement, as though sealing away the world outside. She sat down beside Mrs. Sandford, her voice like the soothing balm of a calm night. "My dear," she said kindly, "you needn't worry any more. It's all quite over now." Mrs. Sandford, however, her pale face drawn and weary, shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening with the remnants of fear that still clung to her. "It's never truly over, is it?" Her voice cracked, as if the weight of her long-held terror had become a part of her very soul. "Not when you've lived with this constant shadow of fear for so many years." Her trembling hands twisted the delicate lace of her handkerchief, the fabric slowly unraveling in her grip. "They said the war ended," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of secrets long buried. "But for us it didn't. Not for those of us who knew the wrong secrets." Miss Marple's gaze softened as she sat there beside her, her presence steady and unshaken. There was something in her stillness that seemed to calm the air itself. "Fear does settle into the bones, my dear," she said gently, her voice as steady as the ticking of a clock. "But fear, you see, is like a ghost. It can only hurt you if you allow it to." Mrs. Sandford's laugh, brittle and hollow, echoed in the room. "You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple." Miss Marple gave a soft, almost imperceptible smile, her voice remaining calm yet resolute. "Not simple, dear, but possible." She reached out and carefully took the handkerchief from Mrs. Sandford's grasp, folding it with methodical precision, as though tidying away both the fabric and the lingering fear that had bound Mrs. Sandford's heart for so long. "The truth," she continued, "is always far less frightening than the stories we tell ourselves in the dark corners of our minds." Mrs. Sandford said nothing, but Miss Marple could see the subtle shift in her posture, the way her fingers loosened their vice-like grip on the lace. Miss Marple's expression softened, and she rose from her seat, extending her hand toward Mrs. Sandford. "Come along, my dear," she urged in her quiet, soothing tone. "The past cannot harm you if you walk toward it, rather than running from it." There was a long pause, a moment of stillness that stretched out before Mrs. Sandford, and then, with a hesitant but decisive movement, she placed her trembling hand into Miss Marple's, allowing herself to be led forward into whatever peace the future might hold. Later that afternoon, as the wind picked up, Miss Marple stood alone on the blustery promenade, her figure silhouetted against the grey sky. She watched the waves as they slowly rolled toward the shore, their rhythmic motion a constant reminder that time, like the tide, never stood still. The sea air was sharp and invigorating, carrying with it the scent of salt and something else, something ancient, as if the very air had witnessed generations of secrets being carried away on the waves. Beside her, Gladys, wrapped tightly in her cardigan, let out a contented sigh, her gaze softening, as she looked out at the horizon. "Well, that's it then," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "All over. Smuggling, murder, all right here in our little hotel." Miss Marple's smile was faint, her gaze still lingering on the endless stretch of water. "It's a curious thing, Gladys," she murmured softly, her tone almost philosophical. "In my experience, the setting changes more than the people." Gladys, puzzled, tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" she asked, genuinely curious. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her mind seemingly miles away. "In St. Mary Mead, It might be a quarrel over a rosebush, or a disputed will that brings the darkness to light. Here at this seaside hotel, it's old crimes, buried long ago, that are washed up by the tide, carried back to shore by the sea. She turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with quiet contemplation. But human nature, my dear, that never changes. Gladys gave a small shiver at the thought, but Miss Marple's voice remained calm, unwavering, like the steady ebb of the ocean. Fear, love, guilt, those old familiar emotions that make people lie, betray, and sometimes even kill. They're the same in a village as they are in a grand hotel. People are creatures of habit, Gladys. Their flaws, their weaknesses, they remain constant, no matter the setting. Miss Marple turned away from the sea, as if the answer had already settled in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Only the scenery changes, she said quietly, almost to herself. With that she took her first step back toward the hotel, her gait light and untroubled as always, her thoughts as clear and precise as ever. Behind her, the waves continued to crash on the shore, carrying with them the past, pulling it out to sea, as though it had never existed at all. But Miss Marple knew better. The past never truly fades. It lingers like the scent of salt on the breeze, always waiting for the right moment to resurface. The present may be calm, but beneath the surface, the tides of human nature never cease to flow.